Well, it is my great pleasure to welcome all of you to this commemoration by Stanford University of Constitution Day. It's great to see such a good crowd to come out for this event. And it's even more of a pleasure to introduce our speaker for this evening, to welcome back to California one of California's leading jurists and legal figures. Judge Janice Rogers Brown was born in Alabama, and I'm not going to give the date, but I will give you a hint. She attended segregated schools in Alabama as she was growing up, and her parents were involved in the early civil rights movement. She moves out to California, at which point in time, according to her own quoted remarks, she was so far to the left that she could be described as a Maoist. I think she's come back slightly toward the center since then. So she came out to California for college and then went to UCLA Law School, had a distinguished career in public service and state government, culminating first in being the legal advisor to the governor of the state, then an intermediate appellate judge, then for roughly 10 years, almost 10 years, a justice of the California Supreme Court, from which position President George W. Bush nominated her, and she was confirmed after a quite bruising and controversial battle that you may remember, but which is blessedly now behind us, confirmed to a position on the District of Columbia Court of Appeals, where she is emerging as an extremely interesting voice, considerably more libertarian than most conservatives, somewhat more conservative than most liberals. I would call her an iconoclast and an independent thinker. I think we're in for a treat. Thank you very much for coming, and welcome back.
Well, good afternoon. I thank Stanford University and Stanford Law School, the Stanford Constitutional Law Center, and Professor Michael McConnell for inviting me to give this Constitution Day lecture. And I can tell you that I am very glad to be back and spend this time with you. When we got off the plane here, we picked up our bags and were on our way to a rental car. And my husband was in front of me, and he looked back at me and he said, "You know, I have gone 8 steps and nothing has bitten me. We must be back in California." So when I tell you that I'm glad to be here, I really mean it. Dwell on the past, and you'll lose an eye, says a Russian proverb. Forget the past, and you lose both. Citizenship Day, a day set aside to give special consideration to the rights and responsibilities of citizens under our Constitution, was established in 1952. It has survived into the early 21st century as Constitution Day. But I wonder what Americans of 2052 will make of the holiday. If history books are still written then, they'll probably be on Kindles. I'm not sure that Constitution Day will even make it into a footnote. Ours is not the America the founders hoped to establish, and we are not the people who managed to sustain it for a couple of hundred years. Thomas Wolfe warns us that we can't go home again, and Tennessee Williams points out that the longest distance between two places is time. Like all writers who excel at their craft, their words resonate with something we all learn for ourselves, one way or another. And that lesson is as true for nations as it is for individuals. Abraham Lincoln, in a prophetic speech at the Young Men's Lyceum in Springfield, Illinois, said that what no invading foeman could do, the silent artillery of time might accomplish. As a nation of free men, said Lincoln in 1837, long before he came to national attention, we must live through all time or die by suicide. He believed that fading memory, grown more and more dim by the lapse of time, was the greatest danger to our political institutions. The history that could once be read in the battle-scarred lives of our fathers, brothers, and sons, what he called the pillars of the Temple of Liberty, had crumbled away. And that temple itself must fall unless the succeeding generation replace the old revolutionary passion with civil reason, molded into general intelligence, sound morality, and in particular, a reverence for the Constitution and laws. Lincoln and his generation succeeded in preserving the Temple of Liberty with new pillars, hewn not from the solid quarry of sober reason, as he had predicted in 1837, but from what he called a new birth of freedom that extended America's founding promise of liberty to all Americans. I fear that we now find ourselves on the precipice of another constitutional crisis. While Lincoln perceived widespread lawlessness and violence, I see a more fundamental schism in our national culture. The triumph of will portends the total defeat of community, and the harbinger of that unhappy fate is the death of honor. My subject is the Constitution, but I'll start with the Declaration of Independence, without which there would have been no nation to constitute in the summer of 1787. When the rebels of 1776 signed the Declaration, they mutually pledged to each other their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor. I suggest we may better understand the promise of the Constitution if we understand the last word of the Declaration. I don't mean there are hidden meanings in the text that will suddenly become clear. The word honor only appears once in the Constitution, in the last of the impeachment clauses. Rather, I mean the success of the Philadelphia experiment has something to do with the distinctive honor culture that it gave birth. We may still need something of that culture even now if the Union is to persist. Whether we can still understand the founders' sacred honor is another question. As in Lincoln's day, our constitutional crisis coincides with a bad case of cultural amnesia. And what Lincoln observed was nothing new under the sun. Thucydides, in his history of the Peloponnesian Wars, remarked that words, in a time of societal upheaval, lose their meaning. And loss of language contributes in a vicious cycle to the further degradation of culture, for we lose our history as we lose our words. Where this forgetfulness is willful, it is difficult to distinguish from ingratitude. The causes of the affliction are as varied as the cultures in which the rot appears. But whatever the causes, in the West, the symptom is plain. It shreds constitutions and upends civilization. It blots out what is or should be written on the heart. But many of us no longer care. Busily worshiping at the altar of the great God autonomy, in the church of multiculturalism, dutifully reading from the Catechism of Political Correctness, we shrug off our history as an irrelevant relic of the pale, stale, and male past. What snippets we think we know have become a cause for embarrassment. Like Thucydides, I see honor as one of the chief casualties of our cultural memory loss. Losing the concept of honor has, I suggest, put American constitutionalism in jeopardy. A code of honor, Lee Harris observes, is, and I'm quoting from him, essential to the survival of civilized values in a community. Enlightened self-interest cannot replace it, nor can all the abstract ideals and values in the world. The code of honor must rather be embodied in the deepest customs of the society and ingrained into the character structure of its leaders. Anything that threatens this code of honor is a threat to the survival not only of a community's values, but of the very existence of the community. If we are to rediscover what the founders meant by honor, we must try to understand that concept in the founders' cultural context. for the American version of honor was distinct from its manifestations throughout history. In its most primitive form, honor is essentially public esteem for physical dominance in men and chastity in women. At its core, this is how honor still operates in many contemporary honor cultures, and we see this version of honor behind Islamist honor killings as punishment for perceived infidelity. In the West, though, the concept of honor has never been static. Western culture in every era has accommodated traditional honor to the competing principles in Christianity, namely humility, mercy, and love of one's enemies. These seemingly antithetical value systems have blended in various combinations throughout history, from medieval chivalry to Victorian courtesy. Western civilization has been a balancing act between traditional honor and Christian virtue, between the desire for public acclaim on the one hand and for inward virtue on the other. Looking back from the vantage point of our post-honor society, the founding era may represent the most perfect union between these divergent strains in our cultural DNA. To Hamilton and the audience of the Federalist Papers, the love of fame was the ruling passion of the noblest minds. But the love of fame was tempered by a love of virtue, or more accurately, the founders aspired to be famous for their virtue. This was not a sentiment they conjured up themselves in Philadelphia. Rather, it permeated the English-speaking culture of the day. Adam Smith, writing in Scotland in 1759, described the desire for praiseworthiness, not mere praise, as the highest human impulse. But Smith also called a complete insensibility to honor and infamy the vilest and most abject of all states. As Washington biographer Joseph Ellis put it, character was not just who you were, but also what others thought you were. In some ways, I think it was this desire for praiseworthiness that won the revolution. The events of war are uncertain, John Adams wrote to Abigail. We cannot ensure success, but we can deserve it. He was paraphrasing a line from Joseph Addison's play Cato, a favorite of George Washington, who had it performed for his troops at Valley Forge. Washington paraphrased the same line in two of his letters. It was a sentiment that captured perfectly the patriots' motivation. They fought not just to win, but to merit victory. It was a familiar goal to Washington, who knew defeat as well as victory, but cultivated a reputation for honor in both. As one newspaper described Washington's early military career, he earned a high reputation for military skill, integrity, and valor, though success has not always attended his undertaking. The founding generation was not a generation of supermen. It included cowards as well as heroes. But when the founders spoke the language of honor, everyone knew what they meant. Honor was a universal aspiration, even though it was not universally obtained. Thus, John Jay sought to dissuade would-be defectors by appealing to their sense of honor, saying their unmanly conduct gave him great concern. Quote, "We feel too much for your honor and reputation not to be uneasy." To deserve victory, the founders demanded courage in the face of terrible adversity. On Christmas Eve, 1776, Washington ordered Thomas Paine's first pamphlet on the American crisis read to his troops. It is the rousing call for courage that starts, "These are the times that try men's souls." And it includes these words, "Tyranny, like hell, is not easily conquered, yet we have this consolation with us, that the harder the conflict, the more glorious the triumph. What we obtain too cheap, we esteem too lightly. 'Tis dearness only that gives everything its value." To the founders, the times that try men's souls were also the times that prove men's mettle. They were occasions to be faced with courage, not avoided at all costs. Often, when I begin working on a speech, a piece of music will start playing in my head. So most of my speeches have a soundtrack. But this one was different. The idea of a triumph made more glorious by the struggle necessary to win it calls to mind a painting. It's a work entitled "Blessed" by the English artist Mackenzie Thorpe, and you probably see a depiction of it up there. At its center is an enormous heart and a dark, jagged mountain. At first, that is all you see. And then you realize there is a human figure on the mountain. He's very small, but if you look up there, you will see him. And you will see that the trip has taken its toll. You can feel the weight and the strain of the burden and the determination of that toiling figure. The summit is just out of sight, but the climber must be close to it. The ascent has been long and arduous, and his gaze is downward, so it's not clear he knows the goal is close. But his posture says, commitment, perseverance, there will be no turning back. I fell in love with that painting because I could see in it my life, my family's history, my country's struggle. I think it powerfully conveys the understanding that being blessed is not a frolic. Blessedness is at least as demanding as it is rewarding. I think that's what John Adams meant when, the day after the Continental Congress passed the Resolution of Independence, he wrote these words to Abigail. He said, "I am aware of the toil and blood and treasure that it will cost us to maintain this declaration and support and defend these states. Yet through all the gloom, I can see the rays of ravishing light and glory. I can see that the end is more than worth all the means." Washington, looking back at that moment, from the end of his presidency, acknowledged the toil and blood he and his countrymen had expended and counted it all gain. To him, the benign influence of good laws under a free government was the happy reward of our mutual cares, labors, and dangers. The founding generation counted the cost of freedom, and they were willing to pay the price. More than that, their honor demanded it. The honor was not only a matter of individual esteem, but of national reputation. Just as America's approach to the problem of human liberty was unique, America developed a distinctive honor culture. When Alexis de Tocqueville came to visit in 1831, he marveled that the honor system of the European aristocracy had been largely supplanted by a democratized and distinctly American conception of honor. Honor was not just for elites anymore. Americans favored industry and despised idleness, a reversal of the European aristocratic honor code. Tocqueville perceived that America still placed courage as the highest virtue, but that American courage often manifested itself in feats of enterprise. Western honor, in contrast with its primitive predecessors, esteems humility, even though that trait is in tension with honor's preoccupation with reputation. In the honor code of the founding era, therefore, the greatest men were those whose ambitions were subservient to their revolutionary principles. No one illustrates this quality better than Washington. Consider his general orders on the eve of battle, July 2nd, 1776, when he told his army the time was near at hand that would determine whether Americans are to be free men or slaves. He said, "The fate of unborn millions will now depend under God on the courage and conduct of this army. We have therefore to resolve to conquer or die, our own country's honor. All call upon us for a vigorous and manly exertion, and if we shamefully fail, we shall become infamous to the whole world." Urging his soldiers to rely upon the goodness of their cause and the aid of the Supreme Being who holds victory in his hands, Washington exhorted them to show the world that a free man contending for liberty on his own ground is superior to any slavish mercenary on earth. In his affectionate farewell to his army, he sounds some of the same themes. After telling his soldiers that the singular interpositions of Providence in our feeble condition were such as could scarcely escape the attention of the most unobserving, and noting that their unparalleled perseverance through 8 years of suffering and discouragement was little short of a standing miracle, Washington tells the troops they may console themselves with the knowledge that they have witnessed events that have seldom taken place upon the stage of human actions and probably never will again. They have, despite violent local prejudices and a predisposition to despise and quarrel with each other, become, he says, one patriotic band of brothers, a disciplined army formed from the most unlikely raw materials. Even under circumstances of the most severe hardship and grievous neglect, Washington steadfastly urges the Army to understand how and why they must set an example of honor. And nowhere, I think, is this character more strikingly displayed than in his confrontation with his officers at Newburgh. After his army achieved a victory in Yorktown, treaty negotiations dragged on and on and on. And the army, which had been for most of its existence poorly provisioned and rarely paid, remained in the field while the talks dragged on. After many months without pay, promises of a generous pension seemed illusory to the troops, and there was no wonder because they had been made many promises before that had never been kept. So a group of officers in the Army who were angry over this and over Congress's fecklessness received a petition that urged them to stop begging for relief from Congress, to throw off Washington's leadership, and to seek redress for their grievances at musket point. Washington became aware that this was afoot, and though initially he didn't want to intervene, after he read the petition, he said he felt that he must. This is a man who had written letter after letter interceding on their behalf, trying to get Congress to take action. And of course, he had not been invited to this meeting because it was a mutiny after all. And so when he came in, there was some consternation. But he began by promising to continue to lobby and to extend every effort and power at his command to obtain justice for his army. And then he concluded by entreating them not to take any measures which, viewed in the light of reason, would lessen the dignity and sully the glory that the army had maintained. He said, "Let me request you to rely on the plighted faith of your country and place a full confidence in the purity of the intentions of Congress." He said, "You will, by the dignity of your conduct, afford occasion for posterity to say, when speaking of the glorious example you have exhibited to mankind, had this day been wanting, the world had never seen the last stage of perfection human nature is capable of attaining." I think it's really one of his finest speeches, and it really, to me, is quite reminiscent of Shakespeare and the king's oration before Agincourt. But that was not the whole of this story. After saying that, he turned to leave, and then he stopped and found this letter in his pocket that had been written by one of the delegates to the Continental Congress who had promised that he would work to fulfill the government's obligations. And he pulled this letter out and he started trying to read it, and he stumbled over the first few words, and he stopped and he pulled out some spectacles, which was kind of a new thing, and he had just gotten these spectacles apparently. He had not been seen wearing them before. And he stopped, he pulled out the spectacles, put them on. He said, "Gentlemen, you must excuse me. I have grown gray in your service and now find myself going blind." Well, that pretty much was that. When I read the account of this, it seems to me that many of the people who write about it say a little smugly, well, you know, that was a lot of drama. But when I read it, I thought, you know, he's not being maudlin or manipulative. He's actually recalling to them another aspect of honor. He talked to them first about their honor, and then he evoked for them the requirement of serving his honor. That is to say, this band of brothers had a reciprocal obligation. And so he had always tried to take care of them, and their failure in this way would be his failure too. At least that's how I read that. And Newburgh was probably his most dramatic performance, but it was not the only cause of wonderment. Less than a year before that aborted coup, one of his officers had urged Washington to declare himself king, and Washington had emphatically refused. He said, if I am not deceived in the knowledge of myself, you could not have found a person to whom your schemes are more disagreeable. Jefferson credited Washington's moderation and virtue with preventing the American Revolution from coming to the same end as many others by subverting the liberty it was intended to establish. In fact, Washington won praises even from his enemies. After the war, Washington hastened to Philadelphia to resign his commission and cede authority to the civilian government. On hearing that Washington had promptly laid down his sword, King George III said that act, quote, placed him in a light the most distinguished of any man living, and made him, quote, the greatest character of the age. Even the often acerbic Abigail Adams did not disagree. Writing to her sister after Washington's second term as president, Abigail said of Washington, possessed of power, possessed of an extensive influence, he never used it but for the benefit of his country. When assailed by faction, when reviled by party, he suffered with dignity and retired from his exalted station with a character which malice would not wound nor envy tarnish. If we look through the whole tenor of his life, history will not produce us a parallel. I think from Abigail, that's high praise indeed. And I think America's distinctive honor culture is actually reflected in the Constitution. We see honor-bound assumptions in the traits of the offices it created. But I think what is most significant and what really is exceptional about America is that American honor was a characteristic of the people, not just the elites. And accordingly, we see in the Constitution expectations of an honorable citizenry. In the limited form of government the Constitution set in motion, we were a people who had just shaken off tyranny, the most terrible affront to honor, and we weren't going back. Our Constitution entrusted the people with responsibility for electing their representatives. It gave Congress limited powers and reserved the rest implicitly and later explicitly to the sovereign people. This was a system designed for a responsible and self-sufficient people, a proud people, an honorable people. I think our Constitution to some extent reflects the convention's confidence in Washington's character. The executive is in some ways the least defined aspect of our divided government. And I think some of those contours were deliberately left vague to be filled in by the tradition and practice George Washington, our first commander-in-chief, would bring to the job. For more than 2 centuries, the trust of his countrymen was fully vindicated. His unstinting patriotism, his strict sense of honor, even his realistic assessment of the frailty of human nature seems to have seeped into the American psyche. The examples he gave us at Bunker Hill and Trenton and Newburgh, we took to Bull Run and Gettysburg, to Normandy, Okinawa, and Iwo Jima, to the Yalu River and Saigon, and to the Brandenburg Gate. He sought to imprint a national character at the founding that would be the bedrock of an honorable and just nation. His success is evident in Grant's magnanimity to the Army of Northern Virginia at Appomattox Courthouse, in Martin Luther King Jr.'s peaceful and lawful protests seeking, quote, the riches of freedom and the security of justice, which he described as the promissory note the architects of the Republic signed when they wrote the magnificent words of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. I think it still echoed when John F. Kennedy promised in his inaugural address to pay any price, bear any burden, meet any hardship to assure the survival and success of liberty. Our history is lit with testimonies to the vibrancy of Washington's vision and the perspicacity of the founders. After swearing the same oath Washington first prescribed, President Kennedy said, "The world is very different now, and yet the same revolutionary beliefs for which our forebears fought are still at issue around the globe. The belief that the rights of man come not from the generosity of the state, but from the hand of God, We dare not forget today that we are the heirs of that first revolution. Let the word go forth from this time and place to friend and foe alike that the torch has been passed to a new generation of Americans. Even in 1987, when an American president, a British prime minister, and a Polish pope combined forces to give a hard shove to the tottering edifice of global communism, a shove that would bring, by 1989, an end to World War III, enough remained of the honor culture of old for President Reagan to predict the Berlin Wall would fall because, quote, it cannot withstand faith, it cannot withstand truth, it cannot withstand freedom. When Lincoln, in his 1837 address at the Springfield Lyceum, called on every American to pledge his life, his property, and his sacred honor to the support of the Constitution and laws, the audience knew intuitively what he meant and could be expected to respond favorably to that invocation of the Patriot's Honor Pledge. But by the time Reagan spoke, the notions of honor and patriotism were already giving way to a culture of repudiation. In contemporary America, we find the language of honor embarrassing, not inspiring, the stuff of self-important Boy Scouts, not serious men and women. There are things that we lose when we lose this notion of honor. We've traded heroes for celebrities, ambition for alms, and national pride for self-loathing. Heroes, in the enduring words of the Commodores, make the sun rise in the morning, make the moon shine bright at night, and make our lives a little stronger. You have to be my age to remember those lines from the Commodores. But I found it very interesting. We used to have national heroes, men and women who, by their example, shaped our collective sense of honor and inspired us to virtue. Now heroes are out of vogue, and as for the heroes we once celebrated, it's now more fashionable to highlight their flaws than to praise their virtues. I recently visited an exhibit the National Park Service has developed at the site of George Washington's Philadelphia residence. This is the house Washington lived in while presiding over the Constitutional Convention in 1987 and during his presidency from 1990 to 1997. Washington played a critical role in the founding of this republic. Without his leadership, humility, and grace, there might never have been a Constitution to celebrate. Moreover, Washington, a beloved military hero, without peer, submitted to the limitations of the executive office he had helped to form, and then voluntarily ceded all power at the end of his second term. These facts are given short shrift in the exhibit where they are mentioned at all. Its overriding concern is to reveal Washington's hypocrisy as the slave-owning president of a republic founded on the ideal of liberty. Michael J. Lewis was not exaggerating when he called the President's House a national monument to the sins and failings of the Founding Fathers. I call attention to the myopia of this exhibit, not to say the founders were without sin. To the contrary, Washington demonstrated admirable self-knowledge when at the end of his presidency he asked his country's indulgence for his failings. He said, "I am too sensible of my defects not to think it probable that I may have committed many errors." My point is that this exhibit is typical of our modern preoccupation with knocking heroes off their pedestals, and Washington's hope that his faults would be consigned to oblivion is entirely incompatible with it, and I think we're worse off without our heroes. Ernest Renan writes that the nation, like the individual, is the culmination of a long past of efforts, sacrifices, and acts of devotion. An heroic past, great men, glory, I mean real glory. This is the social capital on which the national idea is based. We've become cynical about the possibility of public virtue, in part because we've been trained to believe all heroes are frauds. And with no one to embody our national ideals, we've become cynical about those too, and about America itself. Heroes have given way to celebrities who have no claim on our attention but their fame. In other words, we've traded praiseworthiness as our driving ambition for a bare desire for praise, what Adam Smith called the very definition of vanity. So heroes are not all we sacrifice when we sacrifice honor. I think we also sacrifice courage. I think that in parting with the honor code, we give up some things that are very important to us. That distinctly American version of courage, not just physical courage, but endurance, toughness in adversity, courage in industry and commerce is another casualty. Since the New Deal, we have been gradually replacing the American guts and glory with a tax-funded, government-run excuse factory. The noble ambition at which Tocqueville marveled is at risk of being swallowed up by a newfound shame at success and a political imperative that rewards profligacy. And what was once a source of shame, living off the earnings of others, has become too common to attract any notice. During my confirmation process, I got in trouble for having observed, quote, "My grandparents' generation thought being on the government dole was disgraceful, a blight on the family's honor. Today, senior citizens blithely cannibalize their grandchildren because they have a right to get as much free stuff as the political system will permit them to extract." People got very upset by that, and it caused great offense. But my point was that the illusion that we are repaying contributions rather than buying votes means that we draw a curtain between the unwilling almsgivers and the militant alms takers. And that statement could cause such offense is indicative, I think, of our honor crisis. It's easy to see why the honor consciousness of my grandparents' generation was beneficial to the polity as a whole. The more individuals take pride in providing for their own needs, the less society has to contribute to sustain them. Likewise, when financial success is considered a mark of honor rather than a badge of shame, more people will extend more energy to achieve it, and their efforts enrich the entire economic system. I think this is a dangerous time to abandon honor. America's enemies are steeped in an honor culture we no longer comprehend, and they show no sign of flagging. And I think the enemy is not just overseas, but here at home. Current events suggest our honor deficit has placed us at an economic tipping point, no longer taking pride in self-sufficiency or feeling shame at pilfering the birthright of our children. We have disregarded President Washington's practical advice about using public credit as sparingly as possible and avoiding the accumulation of debt. I have said property is the bulwark of liberty, but I suppose if that is true, then honor may well be the moat. A constitutional republic is a fragile form of government that only disciplined self-restraint can preserve. Our honor compels the political class to act with integrity and eschew crony capitalism, and it is honor that constrains the citizens from acquiescing in the transformation of our democracy into a kleptocracy. I had an anecdote here, which I am going to skip most of, but the picture there about mountain climbing reminded me of the one time that I attempted that myself. And those of you who have driven north on Highway 5 will have seen Mount Shasta, which dominates the landscape when you get up toward the north in California. It's a volcanic mountain, so it's not part of a range. It stands there all by itself. It's quite majestic and beautiful. And every time that I had passed it, it was snow-capped. And so I used to have a friend who loved mountain climbing. He thought of this as just recreation, you know. So he talked me into climbing Mount Shasta, and he said, it's a technical climb. It means you have to have an ice axe and a crampons, but you don't have to rappel, you aren't tied together or anything. It's just a hard hike. I said, oh, okay, hard hike, I can do that. And so we went up in stages. So you go up the first day, and you go up to the 10,000-foot level, where by the time you get up that high, you're in deep snow, and people have to break trail. That is, they have to kick steps into the snow so that you can follow them up. That's what breaking trail means, by the way. So it was great to have somebody with size 13 shoes, you know, kicking those steps up there. You could just follow them very easily. But by 5 in the afternoon, we reached a place called Lake Helen, which is actually just a little flat place in the mountain. It's not a lake at all. But we put our tents there, and we had our evening meal. Before we bedded down, they said, well, there's a brief safety lesson that we have to give you. And the safety lesson, really, it took all of 90 seconds. They said, here's the deal. When we start for the summit in the morning, you'll have to put the crampons on your shoes. I don't know if any of you have used these, but these are like metal spikes that you tie on to your hiking boots, basically. And they have a little sort of curved end to them. So they said, put the crampons on, make very sure that they are absolutely secure. This is really, really important. The only other thing you need to know is if something happens and you should start to slide, you have your ice axe. Try to keep your feet downhill, roll over, dig in with the ice axe, and hold on. Okay, that was the safety lesson. So we get up the next morning, and I'm all ready to go, and I think this is great. And I put on the crampons, and I got them well attached to my hiking boots. And you can't climb straight up this sheer face, so you go diagonally, and then you cut back diagonally, and you keep inching up the mountain that way. And I was doing that, and I was feeling pretty good. I started to get confidence, like, this works. I'm like Spider-Man, you know? I'm on this sheer cliff, and I can do it, you know? And this is really pretty exciting. So when you look up at the mountain, the climb seems impossible. But when you actually start going, you can see how it's possible to climb that way. So I was feeling great. My confidence soared. We were all laughing and joking and encouraging each other. And all of a sudden, I heard a scream, you know. And I just looked around. That's all I had time to do. And someone hurtled right past us, you know. And the crampons made us secure, but not nimble. We were like locked into the ice. There wasn't a thing that we could do. He went swooping right past us. And we watched, horrified and helpless, as he shot toward a spot where the mountain just dropped away. And we didn't know what was over the edge. We couldn't see below. And we thought maybe it's just a sheer drop. And he was going at such velocity that I really thought he's going to fly right off this mountain. I mean, he's just going to keep going. And just as I thought all was lost, he crashed into a boulder. It was the only rock visible anywhere on that slope, and he hit it. It stopped him. And he got up, and it said, you know, I'm not injured, I'm okay. But it had all happened so fast. He had apparently decided he was a little bit tired, and he was going to sit down and rest. And when he sat down, because the slope is so icy, his body heat just shot him right off the mountain. But I noticed when he finally got up and all was well, I thought, you know, he made absolutely no effort. The safety lesson was completely lost. He didn't use the ice axe at all. He still had it in his hand. You know? I don't know if he forgot those instructions or he was moving so fast that he just didn't have time to save himself. But I will tell you that I have some of the same sense of horrified helplessness when I consider the prospects for Western liberal democracy. I wonder how we have come to this, the noble experiment in human liberty, reduced to flash mobs who prey on their fellow citizens because they can, zombie parades by public employees too self-absorbed to refrain from disrupting a celebration for disabled children, and educated women who define their honor by organizing slut walks. I think it's been such a long, hard climb, and we have come so near the summit. But now we've started to slide, and that downward velocity feels to me as if it's increasing. Over the years, a number of thoughtful political philosophers have reached similar diagnoses about our national ailment. And today I'm going to propose something that probably sounds strange, but that, you know, the antidote among many palliatives that may help may be the restoration of this peculiarly American notion of honor that we're discussing. If we can understand what has been lost, perhaps we can begin anew our ascent to that city on the hill, which has ever been the claim on our destiny. I think American constitutionalism captured its unique moment in history because it was just that mix of providential deference, pessimism about human nature, and prudence necessary both for human flourishing and for the survival of a republic. Because our system of ordered liberty grew out of a culture steeped in these kinds of religious sensibilities, American honor has historically included not just a sense of destiny and blessedness, but also an understanding of burden and obligation, of duty and responsibility. I think His Excellency George Washington understood better than anyone else American independence depended as much on providential grace as it did on military prowess. Victory required the nation's freedom fighters to summon up the old courage, but it also required them to put their trust in a higher power than horses and the chariots of men. Upon the blessing of heaven and the bravery of men, wrote Washington, our country can be saved. And I realize that it is no longer politically correct to talk about God and to talk about things like providence, that people often find that somewhat off-putting because we're told, well, pluralism just doesn't permit us to focus on that part of our heritage. It's not, and in fact, many of the writers, historians, go to great lengths to show that there was no religious content to the revolution or the founding. I think that's wrong. Locke certainly was involved, but I don't think by any means that that's all that was involved. And when you look at what they wrote and what they said in their most private moments, it seems to me very clear that there is more to this. And I am more persuaded by Michael Novak's view. He says the American eagle flies on two wings, reason and religion. It's not just the one. And I think in abandoning their faith, we have lost sight of the lessons about human nature that it taught. And central to that conception is this idea that the function of the state was to restrain the dangerous elements within human nature without limiting more than necessary the liberty they had fought to protect. In Madison's words, as there is a degree of depravity in mankind, which requires a certain degree of circumspection and distrust, so there are other qualities in human nature which justify a certain portion of esteem and confidence. Republican government presupposes the existence of these qualities in a higher degree than any other form. The founders were realistic, pessimistic even, about the dangers to liberty from within and without the nation they were establishing. In this sense, the founders were anti-utopian. We can see in the constitutional system of checks and balances in which the powers of each branch are checked by the other two branches, and the powers of the federal government are limited by the powers reserved to the state. I think that healthy dose of pessimism was its saving grace. American pessimism made room for honor. It sought to cultivate qualities of character that would both check the enemy without and tame the power lust within. We are, as Madison pointed out, not angels. In the state of nature, we would be ruled by our vanity and rationalize our worst instincts, envy, malice, and selfishness. Just as providence is the antidote to hubris, pessimism may be the antidote to the dual temptation of corruption and fantasy ideology. What cannot be prevented must be limited. So what America really gave to the world was this notion of ordered liberty. It's not unbridled license, not the rights of man, ordered liberty. The founders were, in John Vesper's characterization, moderate moderns, not the radical nihilistic moderns who dictated European history. Our founders rejected absolute freedom, absolute equality, and pure democracy. And it was their moderation that allowed America to survive as long as it has. Pierre Manet sums up Tocqueville's advice to liberal Democrats when he advises them to love democracy moderately. He says, Daniel Daniel Mahoney echoes this theme, noting the threat unbridled democracy poses to the freedom and integrity of human beings. Burke declares that the only real liberty to which is that which is connected with order, and warns that without order and virtue, liberty cannot exist at all. Roger Scruton notes that when Adam Smith made freedom central to his vision of the modern economy, he was clear that freedom and morality are two sides of the same coin. A free society is a community of responsible beings. It is not a society of people released from all moral constraint, for that is precisely the opposite of a society. By now, I think the moral of the story should be clear. Liberty must be liberty under God if it is to do justice to the spiritual nature and limitations of human beings. To put it another way, institutions, laws, restraints, and moral discipline are part of freedom and not its enemy, and liberation from such things rapidly brings freedom to an end. However philosophers choose to describe it, modest liberty, ordered liberty, or liberty under God, the lesson seems to be the same. Those who have a passion for liberty must beware of immoderate claims. A dose of pessimism would still persuade us that freedom is not a gift of nature, but the outcome of an educational process, something we must work to acquire through discipline and sacrifice. It seems to me that inculcating precisely those kinds of attitudes and characteristics is precisely the function of what we might describe as the American sense of honor. The founders accomplished a revolution that had no parallel in the annals of human history. And while it is possible to debate how Christian or how religious the founding was, it seems unarguable that the founders understood that a free constitution that rested so entirely on the virtue of the people was a risky proposition, one for which religion and morality were indispensable supports. Or as Pope John Paul noted more recently, the continuing success of American democracy depends on the degree to which each new generation, native-born and immigrant, makes its own the moral truths on which the founding fathers staked the future of the Republic. When the drafters of the Constitution completed their work, Benjamin Franklin looked at Washington's chair, and I'm sure you've heard this story. He looked at the image that was carved on the back and proclaimed it to be a rising sun. And that, I think, is an apt image for its day. The men in that room, motivated by honor and conscious of their dependence on Providence, had reason to believe their noble experiment would succeed, or at least that it deserved success. I looked at Washington's chair a few weeks ago. It still sits where Franklin saw it in 1787, and it still bears the image of a half sun. I am not so sure, though, that the sun still rises. There have always been doubts about the longevity of a democratic republic and the frailty of constitutionalism. We are not the people we were in 1887. They established a great country. All we have demonstrated is how to destroy one. The founders became the men and women they were because of what they lived and learned. They were formed by their experiences as we are formed by ours. But perhaps we can still be informed by what preceded us. We are often quick to acknowledge that American values cannot be imposed on other cultures. The question we now face is whether American values can be retained by an America that itself has become a foreign culture. Even if we as a people cannot return to the honor culture of our forebears, we might still recognize its virtue and seek to benefit from its wisdom. And I was trying to think of some event or some example, not from America, that might sort of show this, that even though we often talk about religion, we talk about virtue, we talk about morality. When I say we, I mean if you look at the language of the founders, that they often use this kind of language. But I don't think that it is necessarily religious in the narrow sense, because I think the kind of language they had and the ideas that they had about honor could achieve a very broad consensus. They have very different ideas. about religion. Some of them were, traditional Christians, some of them much less so, but I think all of them believed in some notion of a creator and something higher and greater than man. And so I think what is really unique about American constitutionalism is the way in which it exalts the ordinary person by expecting of them this ability to transcend their circumstances, to make the hard choices, make hard decisions, do what is right because it is the right thing to do. And I was trying to think of some example for that, and I went on a tour today of your campus, and I found a group of figures, apparently by Rodin, commemorating something that happened in France many years ago. It's called the Burghers of Calais. And I had never seen that before, but apparently in 1884, the French of Calais commissioned this sculpture by Rodin as a memorial honoring the heroes of the 100 Years' War. And he depicts 6 citizens who in 1347 volunteered to leave the defeated city barefoot, tied by the neck with ropes, and offered their own lives and the key to Calais to King Edward III of England, because that would prevent the city being pillaged and would save the lives of all the other people in this community. So what is being commemorated, and it's kind of a sad grouping of people. It doesn't look heroic. They look tired, they look sad, they look as if there is suffering. But the point is the burghers' fortitude, determination, and devotion to their community preserved it from being pillaged at the end of this very devastating siege. And I know that sounds rough, but that really is what I mean when I think about this notion of being blessed. To whom much is given, much is required. To know that you are a part of a community and to care about being part of the community is what's important and exceptional, I think, about what the founders were trying to create. They were not trying to impose virtue on people. They were hoping to give them an opportunity to be virtuous, and they thought it was okay to teach virtue and to try and train people about what moral sensibilities required. I find that sort of fascinating. That is what I think is really exceptional about America's notion of constitutionalism, that it actually put the burden on the people, but that is where the burden should be. So we can't know whether our noble experiment in human liberty will ultimately succeed or fail. We cannot live for, and we should not desire, the praise of men, but we can know in each generation that we have been praiseworthy. If history is any guide, there may come a day when the sun sets on our constitutional endeavor. When that day comes, it will take men and women of vision to start anew, and if Providence smiles on us, they will be men and women of honor. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Judge Brown. Wasn't that a tour de force? I mean, we've heard the words of George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, Hamilton, Adams, Adam Smith, Thucydides, Martin Luther King, and not least of all,
the Commodores.
The Commodores, and Judge Brown herself, and to boot a little bit of advice about how to deal with the rigors of mountain climbing on an ice field, and Mount Shasta. So thank you very much for those stimulating remarks. We have just a little bit of time for a few questions, which Judge Brown has graciously agreed to field. So if there are two microphones here.
I have agreed to field questions, but if you have really hard questions, then ask Professor McConnell. That's our deal.
I'm not as pessimistic as you are.
Oh, that's good.
But I just finished Ron Chernow's 880-page biography of Washington. And you talked about the honor of the founders. I found Thomas Jefferson to be dishonorable.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
He did things behind Washington's back, defamed him, and when he was asked about it, he lied. When he was governor of Virginia during the Revolution, he ran away instead of staying and fighting with his compatriots. So that's my. You want to comment on Jefferson?
I have not read the book, and so I'm not aware of that. I think if Jefferson did those things, it's very strange because in researching this speech, I came across a very interesting comment of his saying the worst thing in the world is to lie. One should always act with the utmost probity and never even begin to do something that is dishonest, because that dishonesty will grow and will come greater and greater. So it's very interesting that he at least spoke this language, of honor and honorable intentions and so forth. But I'm unfamiliar with the book, and so I can't comment on that except to say Gertrude Himmelfarb has a lovely line where she says that basically hypocrisy is the homage that vice pays to virtue. So maybe that's the only answer. He certainly talked as the other founders talked in terms of how men should behave.
Hi, Your Honor. Thank you for coming to speak with us today. I was hoping you could comment a bit about modern politics, and particularly honor as much as you can from your perch on the federal bench. But what does honor mean in terms of in our political institutions, not just in civil society or on the community level or the individual level, which you talked a lot about? Because it seems, if the Federalist has an equivalent to Montesquieu's honor, it would be like responsibility or accountability. But we have a president now who sometimes justly, but sometimes unjustly, always blames other people. We have Republicans who always blame other people. It seems like in Washington, it's always someone else's fault. So I'm wondering, how should we educate them in honor?
I don't want to get into politics. Sitting judges have to really avoid that at all costs. I guess just from a philosophical point of view, the point that I'm trying to make is that, this requires something of us that we really have to take seriously. To have a constitutional republic requires people who are ready and willing to make those, very hard choices, to do the right thing. And so it's not, we don't always exhibit that, certainly. We probably have, we're long past the point. Our politics is different now. It's so strained, I think, and corrupted by the way the nanny state works. I guess that's all I can say. If you get to a point where what you do is you purchase votes with other people's money, I think it becomes very difficult for people to figure out what's going on in terms of the electorate, and people become addicted to that. So I think there's a problem on both sides. I don't think that you can totally blame it all on the politicians. I think there's reciprocity. you know. So I think the way that the polity is behaving affects the way the politicians are behaving and vice versa. So.
Thank you for a very interesting lecture. One of the virtues of the phrase honor killing, which has been very prominent recently, is to call attention to the fact that the flip side of the notion of honor is very often that of violence, and that when people start using the rhetoric of honor, very soon blood is going to be spilled. This is illustrated in some beautiful lines in Shakespeare's Julius Caesar and Henry IV, and one could even say that the development of modern ethics of reason is precisely premised on a replacement of an aristocratic and chivalric notion of honor with a notion of ethical responsibility. In relation to the founders, it seems that the epitome of the conception of honor amongst the founding fathers might well be illustrated by the duel between Hamilton and Burr, which, as we all know, was a personal disaster for the two of them. But in a certain sense, it seems like there's an instance of two northern kind of wannabe gentlemen sort of miming or putting into practice a conception of gentlemanly honor which was pervasive in the South. And in relation to the legacy of the Civil War history, you cited notions of Union examples of honor, but it seems that the rhetoric of honor would more likely, I would imagine, be cited by the Confederate propaganda than that of the United States. So I wonder...
Well, did you say Southern propaganda, or
well, appeals to honor, I would wager, if one were to, you know, sort of scour the historical record of appeals to honor in rhetoric associated with the struggle between the North and South, would probably be as prominent or much more prominent amongst Confederate propagandists than amongst Union supporters.
Well, I think you're correct that there would certainly have been examples of that. Lee's army, you know, perhaps, you know, probably Lee himself. I mean, some of his statements to his troops and things that, you know, he decided to do or not do is certainly true. I realize that in using, I realize that this is a loaded word, and that it's hard to talk about it in any way that, you know, does not suggest to people the bad side of it. But I was trying to make the point that, one, there are many different conceptions of this. It has actually changed, evolved, and you know, what you were saying about the duel, it's quite true. But that sort of notion of gentlemanly honor went away a long time ago, and I guess probably the last vestige of that was what Wellington, you know, in England, who challenged someone who had insulted him to a duel, and then they never fought it. It was, you know, there was letters of apology and the whole thing, and that was kind of the end of that whole notion of dueling and all that kind of thing. And I am not talking about that. I was really trying to find a word for, or a way of describing this notion of duty and responsibility and burden that has to be accepted. And perhaps a better way, you know, Hayek, you know, may have a better way of describing it when he says that you can have agreement in society about means, but not about ends. And so you have to always have some kind of meta-narrative about liberty that says, you know, this is what we believe, and we adhere to it, and we stick to it. Because if you don't have that, then expediency always wins. And so I guess that I'm trying to evoke something that I guess is hard to evoke, and I'm trying to find a language for it.
Just one more short question, and then...
Thank you, Judge Brown. Given that we have this problem of honor right now in our society, can you suggest any practical ways of fixing it? Should that be the government's job? Should that be at an individual level? And if so, how do we inspire individuals that become kind of addicted to maybe step up to the bat and take more personal responsibility?
Boy, you know, if I knew that, I would probably be up there with the other 8 or 9 people who are proposing to solve all of our problems. I don't know exactly what the answer is, because I really do think it has to, it cannot be something imposed from above, and it is clearly not the government's responsibility to do this, although I do think that people in our government have a responsibility to act honorably. And I think a lot of the dissatisfaction and concern and consternation that people are feeling is because they feel like the whole process is corrupt. You know, they don't feel that these are people who are there to serve them. And I think there was a time in the history of this country, and some of those politicians still exist. I'm not saying that they are all, you know, horrible people, but you know, there was a time when people in public service got into public service because they wanted to serve. What a novel idea, you know, I mean, really had this idea that they would take on these responsibilities. I mean, an interesting thing about Washington is that whole time he had agreed to serve without pay. You know, he was never paid while he was leading the army, but he was constantly agitating for pay for his soldiers and for the officers and so forth. So one, I think that somehow as people, you know, as a nation, we have to get back to this idea of what does it mean to be a citizen in a constitutional republic. It's, you know, if we don't believe it, if we don't defend it, if we don't care about it, a constitution is just a piece of paper. It has to be something that is so ingrained, you know, that our automatic response is to defend it. And I don't think that's true anymore.
Thank you very much. And before we give Judge Brown a valedictory round of applause, I did want to invite everyone to go out to the side here. We're having a reception and should be good food and drink and an opportunity to continue this very interesting conversation. And now please join me in thanking Judge Brown.